I don't know what I got myself into choosing Sword of Vermilion for the first game on a year-long series I want to make of looking back at gaming for the last 50 years, up from 1975 all the way to today. The game itself had actually been bouncing around in my head to play again for a few years, and I just never got around to it. So when I came up with this concept, I thought, let's just start with this game and kill two birds with one stone. And man, if for no other reason, there's just not a lot of depth to Sword of Vermilion. And I think, and you could argue with me on that, but I think that's one of the problems with this game. Because looking back on it, I remember seeing the magazine ads for a game that was going to present 3D dungeon crawling along with action-based combat. I do remember getting this game right before Christmas and taking it to my friend Brian's house. We popped it in and we really did enjoy it. He liked it so much that he started to beg his mom to give it to him early because he knew she had bought it for him for Christmas. And I'll definitely say Sword of Vermilion is not a game you burn a Christmas present early on. But at the time, man, this game captured the attention and it pretty much delivered on what it promised to give us. We just didn't know how bad it was back then. I spent about 14 hours recompleting it, and it's not a review, it's not a retrospective. I just want to talk about what I remember from the 90s playing it and how it is 30 years later. Now, the gameplay itself is where things get interesting. As I mentioned, it combines multiple genres of RPG, and your main window is going to be your dungeon crawling 3D side, along with your 2D action combat. The overworld and dungeons are rendered in a pseudo 3D first-person perspective, along with a classic 2D map overlay on your right-hand side. At first, this map is completely blacked out to you, and no amount of exploration will reveal it. It's interesting to compare Sword of Vermilion to a game like Phantasy Star 1, which was released 3 years prior on the Sega Master System, and an 8-bit console at that. In Phantasy Star, traveling through dungeons gave you a very smooth, colorful view of your surrounding area. It made motion seem very clear which way you were headed. Openings and doors and dungeon stairs were easy to find. And unfortunately, Sword of Vermilion really drops the ball on its 3D view. It's almost like it was an afterthought. Moving around just solely by the 3D view is practically impossible. The speed at which your character moves, which you use tank controls by the way, mean you press up to move forward and down to move backwards. Pressing left and right will cause you to turn 90 degrees in either direction. But the scrolling happens so fast and the graphics are so repetitive and choppy that you're going to miss your mark more often than not. And the biggest problem there is every single movement you make has an opportunity to trigger a random battle. And I will tell you, if there's one word to describe the random battles in this game, it's relentless. So rather than exploring blindly and getting into fight after fight with no idea of where you're headed, your best bet is to follow what I call the Sword of Vermilion gameplay loop. The first thing you'll want to do in each new area is visit the closest town. Talk to all the NPCs, as there's usually one who's going to give you a map that uncovers the entire area. Once you have this map, you go outside and you begin to battle to gain golden experience to help get yourself the best armor and level up your stats. Once equipped, you head on to the dungeon and fight some more. Somewhere in that dungeon is going to be a key item, a boss fight, or just the exit on the other side, which leads to another town. But either way, you're going to a new town, or simply an exit out the other side you have to find. No matter what, once you leave the dungeon, you return to the previous town or head to the next one, talk to all the NPCs, one's going to give you a map, the process continues. In these towns, you can wander about freely, talk to NPCs, enter buildings, buy items, weapons, magic, save your game, rest and recover. The sprite work in the villages is easily recognizable as early 1990s Sega Genesis design, and most towns are relatively small. So like with a lot of this game, be prepared to see the same things over and over with only slight variations. In fact, some of the towns are so small, you're going to come across at least one that has no inn and no item shop, which makes it rather difficult if you're finding yourself rather low on health and healing items. This is the kind of unforgiving game design that we had 30 plus years ago, but this is just another example of the sometimes unforgiving and unintuitive game design we had back in the 90s. I have to stop and talk about the music in Sword of Vermilion for a moment because I think this is honestly one of the best things about it. Most of the songs fit the mood just right, but none more than the melodies you'll find in towns and villages. It's classic early Genesis synthesized tunes, but in a variety of styles and with different tones throughout that really don't become too tiresome. It can be dark and brooding when you encounter a town or a boss fight, or upbeat and cheerful as shopkeepers are charging you 35,000 Kim for a sword you're going to use to save them from evil and tyranny. And like a product jingle that you haven't thought of in many years but instantly recall from just the first few notes, the music in Sword of Vermilion came back to me as if I had just heard it the other day. I've even seen videos as recent as 5 months ago of people covering the music of Sword of Vermilion, so clearly it still strokes a chord with people, no pun intended. So if you're into 8 and 16-bit video game tunes, I encourage you to give it a complete listen. Outside of the opening cutscene, the majority of the story unfolds through dialogue between the hero and townsfolk. The writing is standard and simple, with most NPCs repeating the same things over and over. There are the occasional offbeat interactions, such as the woman who berates you for taking a nap rather than leaving immediately to save the men of her village. Outside of this, the writing accomplishes what it needs to, but please don't expect any type of in-depth expositions. Sometimes you'll need to bounce back and forth between NPCs in order to get their dialogue to change, which tells you where you need to go next or what item you have to find. Even if you already know exactly where to go or what to get, certain key items and characters won't show up in their set places until you've talked to that first NPC. Perhaps Sega recognized some of the obscure things that needed to be done in order to proceed, and that's why they included a 106-page strategy guide inside the game manual. This amounted to an entire walkthrough of the game, complete with dungeon maps and item locations. It was a nice thing to have at a time when Prima Games had just been founded in 1990 and GameFAQs was still 5 years away. Alright, let's talk about the combat, because this is where Sword of Vermilion is really going to split players. The random battles happen constantly, and I mean constantly. Sometimes you might finish one fight just to turn to your left 90 degrees and trigger another one. Finish that fight, take 2 more steps, another fight. Decide you're going the wrong direction, turn around in place, fight. I've even run from a fight at times just for a battle to trigger again as soon as I return to the main screen. The funny thing is, I use an emulator to record my gameplay footage for this game, and I found out maybe the RNG is not as random as it actually seems. So the combat itself is real-time based. Triggering a battle will start off with you in the middle of a screen with 1 to 8 enemies surrounding you. You can freely move around, pressing the C button to swing your sword, which actually looks more like you're waving a glow stick in your enemy's face. Land enough hits on your enemy and they'll vanish with a puff of smoke and a grunt. Some of the enemies run straight at you, some stand back and throw projectiles at you, some teleport, and some just seem to move at their own accord. But the real battle here is with the hitbox detection. Sometimes, no matter how skilled you are, enemies are just going to get too close or move too fast at the start of a battle for you to be able to avoid their attack. And this can be really tedious when you start fighting scorpions, who have nearly a 100% chance of poisoning you with just one touch. And this is despite the fact that your character has a ridiculously absurd dexterity stat. Compared to the enemies you'll be fighting, you might as well be wearing cement shoes, you move so slowly. And I can say that because I'm Sicilian. Defeat all your enemies and you'll be taken back to the map screen. And should you lose all your hit points, you'll be resurrected at the last town you visited, but give up 50% of your money, which in this game is called Kim. That was a very typical death penalty for RPGs in the early days, losing half of your money. Now, about a third of the way into the game, you'll be able to unlock magic spells, of which you can equip one single offensive spell at a time. But you'll also get the spell in Audius, a very Harry Potter-ish sounding spell, which lets you avoid random encounters for exactly 30 moves. A move counts as a step forward, a turn to your right, a turn to your left. This can be a real lifesaver when you're trying to make your way from point A to point B, although you may have to cast it 3 or 4 times to make it to your destination unscathed. And it cannot be cast in dungeons, so here's a little tip. Cast it right before you enter a dungeon and it's still going to grant you the full 30 steps of movement before you can be attacked. And speaking of the spell, Sword of Vermilion only allows you to carry 8 spellbooks at a time. Eventually you're going to want to stock up on ones that allow you to travel back and forth between towns, heal yourself, cure poison, cast light in the dungeon. That's not going to leave you much room for additional spells. But to be honest, even towards the end of the game, I was using one of the early level wind spells that was still defeating enemies in 1 or 2 hits, when even the Sword of Massive Destruction that I'm carrying still takes 3, 4, even 5 hits to defeat an enemy. The game maxes out at level 31. You'll want to be as close to that as possible by the end of the game. And here's where we can actually take advantage of the relentless RNG. One of the easiest ways to do this is to stand outside a town and spin your character around and around until a battle occurs. Do this until you're too low on health and recovery magic, and then just pop into the town, sleep to regain all your power, and go back outside and commence spinning once again. Eventually you gain access to the spell Terrafici, which is going to instantly kill every enemy on the screen. So use this spell coupled with this leveling trick, and you'll find yourself maxing out at no time. Now, with so many fights happening, the lack of enemy variety becomes rather obvious. So much, in fact, that this is one of the things I always remembered about the game despite not playing it in 30 years. With the exception of the boss fights, you'll be attacked by the same 12 enemy sprites throughout the entire game. In an attempt to mix it up, these enemies are palette swapped numerous times to bring the total possible creatures encountered to 52. Sometimes the differences are simply increased hit points or faster movement speeds, while a few actually do change up their attack patterns with different projectiles, or even the ability to vanish and reappear elsewhere. And while all this repetitiveness may sound like it lessens the gameplay, combat is quick enough that it won't necessarily get on your last nerve, but it's going to be pressing on the surrounding ones. There are 13 boss fights in the game, and here's where Sword of Vermilion injects yet another style of gameplay into the mix. In an attempt at something more cinematic, which definitely stood out in the screenshots of the advertisements, boss fights are side view one-on-one battles. I appreciate that the bosses add a little variety and have very impressive sprite work, but in my opinion, some of these are the worst fights you're going to have to deal with in Sword of Vermilion. First off, in a boss battle, you're unable to use any kind of magic, which isn't that big of a deal. You're able to move left and right on the screen as well as duck, but your character will always be facing to the right. Many bosses are going to plant themselves on the right side of the screen, so while this isn't necessarily a problem, there are occasional enemies whose mechanics include jumping or flying over you, and that leaves you without any way to attack them when they're on the left side of the screen. Some of the enemies will shoot fireballs at you, and the duck mechanic allows you to avoid the higher projectiles, but you actually need to attack the lower ones or else they smack right into you. And one wrong judgment in attack timing can see the enemies plowing over you and send you all the way back to the nearest town, 50% lighter in the pocketbook. And it's not so much that dying is a big issue, it's the fact that you now have to make your way all the way back to the dungeon and through the dungeon to that boss, all the while dealing with numerous random battles again. Yeah! Despite a lot of my complaints, I really didn't dislike completing Sword of Vermilion again. It might not have held the charm it did for me if I hadn't have played it 30 years ago, and remember all the feelings about being a young kid with these high quality graphics and a brand new era of RPGs. So first time gamers might find this one a little bit tough to get through. But for me, it kind of gave me those 1990s RPG vibes and made me want to stick it out through the end. I just wish a game like this gave you more reasons to explore the overworld map. The strategy guide does give you locations of certain treasures, but there really isn't anything to be gained by exploring the entire world map, let alone with the random battles constantly being thrown at you. I would definitely suggest that if you want to sit down and play through Sword of Vermilion, you do so with existing maps or guides. And hey, if you feel like you're taking something away from yourself by playing with maps or strategy guides off of GameFAQs or the internet, don't forget, Sega gave you that strategy guide right into the manual, so hey, you're kind of just using the tools that were available back then, 34 years ago.